Nyalche Chembur Toto Ningmi Chang, Donen Manam Chembur, Nyalche Dankara Dargan Santo, Shermar, Tumba Turje Chan La Ki Shom Sar, Nishan Roar Zer Nishan Gamsa, Jabur Tuji Shan Yelaman, Jimmy Panzo Jala, Soran. Gonjo Toban Pora Shinjilo, Gonjo Toban Pora Shinjilo, Gonjo Toban Pora Shinjilo.
Profound and subtle Dharma is rarely encountered in eons. Now we hear and follow it. May we realize the Tathagata's meaning. To liberate beings, please generate bodhicitta before teaching. Next, we will discuss the Shurangama Sutra. We have now reached the section in the Shurangama Sutra concerning the physical world and the sentient world. Yesterday, we previously discussed that from the perspective of tantric teachings, manifestations naturally arise from the primordial ground, and within these manifestations, various delusions appear. Sentient beings fail to recognize these delusions. As we discussed yesterday, it is the principle that from what is neither same nor different, differences glaringly appear. As a result, we see this diverse world in all its forms, and the various conditioned dharmas emerge. That was what we covered yesterday. Today, we will go on to discuss the formation of the physical world and the sentient world. This principle is actually quite similar to the principles presented in Omniscient Longchenpa's wish-fulfilling treasury. When discussing the physical world, the formation process described in the wish-fulfilling treasury is generally the same. However, regarding the physical world and the related principles we are discussing today, some ancient masters often explain them by integrating concepts from the I Ching or from Confucian teachings. For example, they use the principle of mutual generation and restriction of the five elements, earth, wood, water, fire, and metal, to draw parallels and explain the concepts. Some Dharma masters consider this an outer path perspective and think it is not very reasonable. Within our own inner tradition, we can fully explain this using pure Buddhist principles. It is entirely possible, and there is no need to teach it that way. Of course, some masters have elaborated extensively by combining other earlier viewpoints. This is heavily discussed in the orthodox transmission of the Shurangama Sutra. It offers a great deal of explanation. Master Hanshan, in particular, utilized many such principles in his writings and provided quite detailed analysis. So there are some minor debates among past great masters on this point. If you have time, I hope you all will look through a few different commentaries, then it will become clear at a glance. Let's start with today's content. How is the physical world formed? The text here says, once a light of understanding is added to enlightenment, the darkness of the primary element space appears, and the interaction of these two complements generates a disturbance in the mind. That disturbance becomes the disk of wind that supports the world. Regarding the physical world first, there is a light of understanding. Different masters have various explanations for this. In the phrase, a light of understanding and the darkness of space, the understanding represents the apprehending subject, while the dark space represents the apprehended object. Some masters believe that the light of understanding is the initial illusion of ignorance. Once it arises, it manifests the external appearance of dark emptiness or obscuration. When this object and subject interact through interdependent conditions, their interaction generates a disturbance. This is due to the initial manifestation of ignorance. Once this occurs, and the external dull or empty phenomena appear, these two conditions interact and generate a disturbance. Some commentaries interpret understanding and dark space simply as a form of ignorance. Relying on this ignorance, the false movement and disturbance of deluded thoughts, a wind disk gradually forms. Their interaction generates a disturbance, and thus the disk of wind comes to be.
Where does this wind disk come from? Actually, it comes from the human deluded mind. The deluded mind is obscure and restless by nature. Relying on the dependent origination and conditions of this restlessness, the wind disk appears. The wind disk is moving. As you know, the defining characteristic of wind is movement. Once the wind disk exists in the universe, the world is supported by wind. It is capable of holding the world up. Other related sutras and shastras state that first there is empty space, and within empty space there is a wind disk. Above the wind disk is a water disk, above the water disk is an earth disk, and above the earth disk are all the mountains, rivers, and lands. Regarding the formation of our world and the supported and the supporting elements of the world, texts like the Ratnagotra Vibhaga and many other sutras and shastras explain it this way. The preceding eon of emptiness is generally understood the same way. Even now, some commentaries on the Shurangama Sutra use illustrations to show that first there is the space disk. This is universally acknowledged, though not explicitly mentioned here. Then, upon this, the wind disk forms. Once the wind disk forms, through the special power of wind, the entire world can be supported. This is the first aspect. After this, in reaction to the mental disturbance, there arises a firm attachment. This solidity is the disk of vajra. This is how the disk of vajra, which holds the world together, comes into being. Next, it discusses the gold disk, because earlier the wind disk was constantly moving within empty space. Due to the movement of the wind disk, the wind gradually transformed into something solid and bright, a firm and distinct substance. This substance is actually called the vajra jewel, or the gold disk. In reality, it is the earth disk. In our wish-fulfilling treasury, when discussing the wind disk, it mentions a type of wind called the gathering wind. This is quite solid. Even within the element of wind, there is a solid aspect. In fact, this is not much different from the vajra jewel disk or the earth disk. Then, a firm attachment arises. This firm attachment here refers to the discriminating deluded thoughts of sentient beings gradually becoming solid. Buddhist logic often states that the external physical world and sentient world are actually manifestations of sentient beings' karma or their discriminating thoughts. Moreover, as these habitual tendencies gradually become solid, the external world is established based on whether these tendencies are solid or not. That being the case, as just mentioned, there is wind in space. Within the wind, a solid substance gradually forms. This is called the gold disk. This solid entity, established or conceptually designated by ignorance, is what we call the gold disk. Relying on this gold disk or earth disk, it can uphold the entire land. That is, the various lands of the physical world. It is actually supported by this. This is our gold disk. The gold disk is such a solid entity. This is the second aspect. The third aspect, thus the disk of vajra is generated, and the disk of wind is generated. From the friction between the wind and vajra disks, there arises the light of the fire disk, characterized by changeability. Next, it discusses the fire disk. As for the fire disk, didn't we just say that this solid discriminating thought, what did it become? It became the vajra jewel, meaning it became gold. Then from this gold disk, this gold formed by discriminating thoughts, and the disk of wind is generated from the disturbance, the moving restless wind appears. If so, it is actually the friction between the wind and the gold. That is to say, the wind disk we just mentioned is the foundation of our entire world. Then, upon the wind, something formed, whether it's called gold or what we call the gathering wind. there is this substance. This can also be called the vajra earth. It is a solid entity. This is called the gold disk. Now this moving wind disk and the unmoving gold disk, the gold and the wind interact, one solid and one moving. As some commentaries explain, between the wind and the gold, one is a solid entity and the other is a moving entity, with one being solid and the other moving. Eventually the fire element is generated. Thus there arises the light of the fire disk. Because there is friction between the wind and the gold, this friction generates heat, which then turns into the light of fire, which is characterized by changeability. Then what does it become? It becomes the fire element possessing this changeable nature. We just had the wind disk, then the gold disk, and then the fire element, the fire disk. The term disk can probably be used here too. We can call it the fire disk. The so-called fire disk possesses a nature of ripening. It's not necessarily burning flames, though there can be burning flames. It seems that during the formation of the world, whether it's the formation after the Big Bang, the world contained both ocean waters and the light of fire. Sometimes the entire world is truly marvelous. In our conceptual thinking, we assume water and fire are incompatible and cannot exist together. However, especially from a geologist's perspective nowadays, when they look at it, there is fire within water and water within fire. Therefore, regarding these phenomena described in Buddhist sutras that we normally cannot observe, we shouldn't rely on our own overly simplistic ideas to decide what is right and wrong. We shouldn't think that way. Some people, the moment they encounter something inconceivable in the sutras, immediately generate conceptual doubts, thinking it's incorrect. Yet when astronomy or science proposes something that is equally impossible for you to accept, you seem to think, because it's scientific, it must be acceptable. It seems some people, because they are unfamiliar with Buddhist views or lack sound right view and hold wrong views, often treat these two identical doubts differently. They feel the doubt regarding Buddhism proves it's unreasonable. As for astronomical doubts, even though you still have questions, you say nothing. Actually, this is unreasonable. Therefore, regarding the formation of the world involving water and fire, now we probably should understand, because in today's world, we basically see many things, including the realms of the universe, astronomy, black holes, the emergence of dinosaurs, the formation of the earth, and the formation of the oceans. In many aspects, various scholars have different theories. Whether you accept them is up to you, but you must know that the Buddhist doctrine offers a specific explanation. You must acknowledge this. Next is the fourth aspect. Moisture arises from the shining of the disk of vajra and turns to vapor in the presence of fire. Thus the disk of water comes into being and encompasses the worlds in the 10 directions. Next we discuss the water disk. What is the water disk? Earlier, when the conditions of the vajra, jewel and wind came together, a kind of moisture, a dampness appeared on the gold disk. As you know, on crystal or gold, regardless of what it is, there is always some kind of vapor, a kind of moisture. This exists on any gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and so on. It is always present. Once this exists, it turns to vapor in the presence of fire. Because there is this moisture, when this moisture comes into contact with the light of fire, the moisture on top gradually evaporates. After evaporating into the air, for instance, sometimes when we have an electric stove with heat, or on some crystal, when heat and moisture are present, this watery substance gradually evaporates. Once it evaporates into the air, it quickly turns into an abundance of rainwater. This rainwater then gradually encompasses all 10 directions. Thus the disk of water comes into being and encompasses the worlds in the 10 directions. Here the water disk is presented later. Previously, in texts like the Abhidharma Kosha or the Wish-Fulfilling Treasury, generally the wind disk comes first, followed by the water disk. There is this sequence. However, some commentaries state that the water disk comes first and the gold disk comes later. This principle is actually found in some Hinayana teachings. There is this explanation. But this explanation is not exclusive to the Hinayana. In many Mahayana sutras and shastras, including the Avatamsaka Sutra and the Ratnagotra Vibhaga, the water disk precedes the gold disk. This principle is also found in Mahayana scriptures. However, there might be both differing viewpoints, because if the water disk comes later, actually the water disk could have already evaporated. If heavy rain falls throughout space, it can encompass everything above the wind, including the water and fire mentioned earlier. When it says it encompasses, the water of the water disk can encompass both the gold disk and the fire disk, because according to our current understanding, the water disk actually constitutes the vast majority. 70% of the earth is composed of water. If so, within this process, this occurrence happens later. But in reality, its current formation has a tremendous relationship with water. There can be different methods of interpretation. These are viewpoints from various sutras and shastras, so we need not worry. Oh, here water is later, there gold is later. What should we do? Which one is right and which one is wrong? We shouldn't worry about this, because across various sutras and shastras, this world is depicted in myriad different ways. Moreover, the karma of us sentient beings is also extremely diverse. If that's the case, some sentient beings perceive the sequence of earth, water, fire, and wind, and the entire supported and supporting structure manifesting in one way before them. Before other beings, it manifests in another way. However, the formation of some worlds indeed begins with the wind disk and the water disk. Some begin with the wind disk and the gold disk. Such phenomena can also exist. Therefore, during your process of listening and contemplating, do not be too narrow-minded. Of course, when we discuss and debate, we can explore everything. But regarding the differing viewpoints expressed by past great masters, you all must learn to accept them. Do not use your own very narrow wisdom to conclude, this is wrong, that is wrong, only mine is right. As for our own wisdom, if you were to weigh it, you should have a clear idea of how many pounds it would be. If you really don't know, you'll find out when you take an exam. You are unable to write many things you should be able to write. You should have memorized many things, and you usually think you are quite good. But when the time actually comes, you are caught off guard by others. Why did they score so well? They don't speak that impressively normally. So you should know your own level. Thus, the past great masters were not like this. So I think sometimes taking an exam crushes our arrogance, which is very good. You feel you are very capable and are inherently quite arrogant, but as a result, after taking an exam, some people never dare to take an exam again. Such situations happen. So everyone should know there are exams recently, so your minds are relatively the moment I mention exams, everyone feels a bit sensitive to it. So usually when teaching, it's quite important to connect it to the current situation. Next, as fire flares up and water descends, their interaction brings about solidity. From the primary element water, the oceans come into being, while the continents and islands come into being from the primary element earth. Then what follows? Earlier we discussed the four primary elements. What follows discusses what are known as the four domains, the domains of water, earth, mountains, and forests. Different commentaries have various explanations. Fire flares up and water descends. As we all know, fire blazes upward into the sky, and water descends from above. So these two, their interaction brings about solidity. if water and fire, because one goes upward and the other goes downward, and their natures are different. After interweaving like this, eventually a relatively solid earth element occurs. Then, based on this earth element, from the primary element water, the oceans come into being. The relatively moist, thoroughly wet, damp things gradually accumulate to eventually become the oceans. Across the vast earth, they become the great oceans, while the continents and islands come into being from the primary element earth. The drier parts, what do they become? Continents or islands. This word tan is like the tan in our everyday word for beach. They should be quite similar. The meaning is that the whole four elements are explained in this way. Thus fire sometimes emerges from the oceans, and rivers and streams flow across the lands. So, because of this cause and condition, as just mentioned, fire frequently arises in the ocean. If fire frequently arises in the ocean, it's not just what we now call volcanic eruptions, where flames often appear in the water. Moreover, in Buddhist sutras such as the Mahayana Sutra of Contemplation of the Mind Ground, and including the Nirvana Sutra, if you look at those commentaries, many of them also discuss this. For example, the Naga king of the ocean holds both water and fire, the fire within the water. Also, when bodhisattvas enter the ocean, they see flames arising within it, and so on. There are many teachings regarding this. So it generally says here that flames frequently arise in the ocean, and on the continents and islands there are actually rivers constantly flowing. There are these things. This is a natural phenomenon. We all know that there are indeed flames in the ocean, and on the continents as well, including our current Yangtze River and Yellow River, various others, be it the Larang River or the Sertar River, the Jinsha River or the Min River. It's like this. Rivers flow across the earth. Mountains form where the primary element fire is stronger than the primary element water. Thus rock gives off sparks when struck and melts when heated. Then, in the process of water and fire coming into contact, if the force of fire is somewhat greater, if it is a bit stronger, then it forms high mountains, and the rocks of these high mountains, when struck together, emit sparks. If you expose it to fire, and the water and fire mentioned earlier, if it melts into liquid, it becomes water. We might talk about molten iron or molten copper, and including some mineral deposits. After melting, they also become liquid. So, as just stated earlier, once fire and water come into contact, if fire wins and water loses, it becomes a mountain. Why do many commentaries speak of fire and water? Fire, as we explained before, represents hatred, and water represents attachment. In this way, actually, all of these, whether high mountains or rivers, these are all manifestations of our attachment, hatred, and ignorance, our discriminating thoughts and deluded ideations. The nature of delusion is impermanent. It alters from moment to moment. Some commentaries explain that because the deluded mind gradually and continuously emerges, actually the formation of the world is sometimes water, sometimes fire. I think right now perhaps the discriminating thoughts of sentient beings are truly quite severe. For this reason, perhaps the hatred of sentient beings is quite intense, and so the occurrence of fires is also quite severe. Moreover, nowadays various countries are all conducting military exercises against each other. This is a very obvious rise in hatred. Also, in some commentaries, hatred combined with arrogance becomes high mountains. Regarding high mountains, what we see is, oh, this is the Himalayas, this is Mount Kailash, very nice. But actually they are manifestations arising perhaps from the arrogance and hatred of many of us sentient beings. A single thought of the deluded mind already fully contains the four elements. Deluded thoughts manifest as the four elements. Master Uyi and many others also explain this quite clearly. This is the formation of high mountains and flowing waters. Then, Vegetation grows where the primary element water is stronger than the primary element earth. Thus the trees and grasses are reduced to ash when burned and exude liquid when they are compressed. Next, it explains, if during the process of intermingling between the earth element and water element, if the water element is victorious, meaning the earth element is weaker than the water element when water wins, then from the earth vegetation grows. It becomes the grass on the mountains, the wood, the forests. Thus the trees and grasses, so these forests and thickets, if they encounter fire and are burned, they turn into ash or earth. If they encounter the vegetation just mentioned, if they are compressed together, they exude liquid. So here, didn't I just mention it? Some say it's the water domain, earth domain, mountain domain, and forest domain. This paragraph discusses the forest domain. I see Master Uyi and some other great masters also say, it is evident that earth, water, fire, and wind are entirely objects within the deluded mind. All of earth, water, fire, and wind are a product of our deluded thoughts, a product of the deluded mind, including our discriminating thoughts. The moving aspect is the wind element. Then the solid aspect is the earth element. So our deluded thoughts, as for deluded thoughts, sometimes they are moving, sometimes they are resting. Various manifestations occur because these inner discriminating thoughts are constant. The external physical world is uneven, or it manifests as the water element. Perhaps the recent water element is caused by attachment, including floods and heavy rainfall. If caused by hatred, fires and wars occur, these external events, then if caused by ignorance, the entire world becomes quite bewildered and chaotic. Why are many of us sentient beings now a bit forgetful? We easily forget many things. Many Dharma friends say, is it because there are pesticides in the vegetables we eat now that I forget things so quickly? Many people worry about themselves, thinking they have contracted some other disease, but actually it might be the collective karma of sentient beings. Sometimes the collective karma of sentient beings is truly inconceivable. Perhaps attachment, hatred, and ignorance often manifest within the minds of the sentient world or in the external world. These distorted interactions together produce the seeds that become the causes for the perpetuation of the world. Because our deluded minds, didn't I just mention attachment, hatred, ignorance, arrogance, and doubt? These deluded minds, these illusory things, combine with the causes of arising illusory discriminating thoughts, and this acts as a mutual cause, producing seeds. This serves as a seed. Because of this cause, the continuation of this world, in fact, is continuous. The physical world, as for this physical world, didn't we just discuss it? Primarily, whether it's love or hatred, or whether this world is harsh or warm, or the current. Look at the severity of the fire element in recent years. In the past there were also such things, though not as frequent. But now many news reports say things haven't happened like this since 1961, haven't happened for over 70 years. It's not just one country. Many countries are experiencing various phenomena. So, regarding our lifespans and what kind of impact the entire physical world brings to us, it's hard to say. Actually, if this physical world is somewhat displeased, if it wants to change, it happens very quickly indeed. We sentient beings are very simple life forms. If the physical world undergoes some changes, the sentient world upon it changes extremely easily. This was about the physical world. Actually, Buddhism teaches that all dharmas are created by the mind alone, and many such principles. But some people feel this is impossible. Did my mind create everything? No, it's not like that. As we explained earlier, the many inquiring and discriminating thoughts in the mind streams of us sentient beings, including the four elements of our own bodies and the four elements outside, are actually a convergence of causes and conditions. With such a convergence of causes and conditions, eventually mutual changes occur. It's not that a single single sentient being generates the entire world. That's not the meaning either. But is it that one sentient being's mindset has no relation to the whole world? That's not it either. This is called the most profound principle in Buddhism, the convergence of causes and conditions. This convergence, when examined from the ultimate truth, is unfindable. But in the conventional truth, it has a particularly firm law. No one can overthrow this law. However, this principle is not a simple one. It's not something a few scholars can study for a few years, like so-called masters or PhD students, and immediately reach a conclusion. It's not like that. The Buddha must have, over countless eons, accumulated merit and purified obscurations, and then attained this unhindered wisdom. This unhindered wisdom perceived its law of dependent origination. Only then did he understand its formation, its duration, and finally the entire process of its destruction. So, in some sense we can say this law of dependent origination is easy to understand, but sometimes it is also not very easy to understand. Next, we will discuss the continuation of the sentient world. The Buddha told Venerable Purna, "Further, Purna, you should know that being's deluded understanding is due simply to the error of adding an understanding to inherent enlightenment." Next, it explains how the sentient world is formed. Didn't we just mention deluded understanding, this deluded, discriminating thought of bright awareness? Of course, the bright awareness we refer to here is not the positive kind of brightness and awareness we normally talk about. Here, it's that relatively clear state of mind. Brightness and awareness are both explained this way. Then this deluded understanding, this deluded thought or discriminating thought of a bright nature, is due simply to. It's not something else. What is it? The error of adding an understanding. That is to say, this mind of bright awareness gradually became confused and became a sentient being. If we recognize it right now, it is wisdom. If we do not recognize it right now, it is ignorance. So, isn't it like a prince turning into a beggar? Originally, it is a bright awareness, it is pure, but it gradually became distorted. The error. I read in the complete record of the 5 lamps, in the Han Buddhism text, the complete record of the 5 lamps, it says there was someone named Jing Chao. When he read this passage in the Shurangama Sutra, that is, being's deluded understanding is due simply to the error of adding an understanding to inherent enlightenment. When he read this principle, he became incredibly conflicted. He thought before the world was even formed, before sentient beings were formed, how could there be ignorance? He was constantly very confused. But later, one time, because of this kind of sensation of doubt in the Zen tradition, as you all know, there is this, in the end, if a master uses a symbolic method to trigger their enlightenment, it's very effective. But later, it seems he was taking a nap in a monastery or somewhere. Later, as he was slowly waking up, he heard the sound of a chime, a ding sound, and through that sound he instantly awakened to the principle mentioned earlier. So, when you go to sleep at night, try it. Recite it a bit, will you? Then set your alarm clock, and in the morning when it goes ding, 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 will you become enlightened? And once enlightened, you won't need to go to class. Wasn't it the case that His Holiness, when he attained realization, didn't go to class for several days? He just kept sleeping like that. It seems he also dreamt of Sakya Pandita. There was such a situation. So from tomorrow onwards, if anyone is late, it means that the night before they attained realization through this line from the Shurangama Sutra. The inevitable consequence is the establishment through delusion of the categories something understood and that which understands. Then below he says, this kind of deluded mind, once this kind of discriminating deluded thought is established, our clear truth, this true nature that genuinely understands the truth, actually, it simply cannot manifest. That is to say, it cannot go beyond, it cannot transcend it. This kind of deluded mind within a certain scope, its power is still very strong. Once it falls into delusion, it also becomes a solid entity. Then whether your true mind, true nature, or clear truth, it cannot intervene. Actually, once we sentient beings truly fall into delusion, often, no matter how good the master is, no matter how great the accomplished practitioner who directly points it out to you or teaches you very profound dharma, you might not feel anything in your heart at all. Occasionally, there's a tiny bit. For instance, sometimes when we transmit tantric teachings, many people feel, have I attained some realization? But 2 days later, when encountering certain situations, oh, I wasn't enlightened. My arising hatred is still very severe. So it is indeed true. Categories of something understood and that which understands are established. So it is that the ear faculty is aware only of sounds, and the eye faculty is confined to visible objects. All 6 objects which are perceived through delusion, resulting in a division into seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, tactile awareness, and cognition. Because of this kind of delusion of our deluded mind, due to these causes and conditions of delusion, actually, within the inherent enlightenment of our Tathagata Garbha, all of these things, whether forms, sounds, odors, flavors, or tactile objects, or earth, water, fire, and wind, their entire fundamental nature is perfectly complete. Our mind nature can also know these, but because of this delusion, our ear faculty cannot perceive beyond the scope of sounds, and the eyes do not perceive beyond the scope of visible forms. As for the others, odor, form was already mentioned earlier, but it's stated here too. Form, sound, odor, flavor, tactile object, and dharma, 6 objects of delusion. Right? Form, sound, odor, flavor, tactile object. Dharma is not mentioned here, is it? All 6 objects which are perceived through delusion without dharma, right? It seems the Tibetan text is the same. But logically speaking, sound and form were already mentioned earlier, and later it's odor, flavor, tactile object, and dharma. If so, what we call the 6 sensory objects, regarding the 6 sensory objects, relying on deluded, discriminating thoughts, our 6 sensory consciousnesses can only perceive their respective objects. Beyond that, there is nothing. So in our world, the deluded seeing, hearing, experiencing, and knowing have been formed. Seeing, hearing, experiencing. Actually, this is quite similar to many explanations in the tantric teachings, because after ignorance appears, the entire original face is lost from sight. Thus, our 6 sensory objects and 6 consciousnesses are formed. That is the meaning. Because of this, our 6 objects perceived through delusion have manifested. The 6 objects of delusion. Sound, form. Do other commentaries mention this? Is there any analysis of this? I didn't have time to look. I just thought of it now. Take another look. Here, all 6 objects which are perceived through delusion. Is it that I just don't know how to explain it? The meaning is that regarding the entire world's external seeing, hearing, experiencing, and knowing, actually, if we had not fallen into delusion, it would be just like the omniscient wisdom of the Buddha. We would understand everything without such restrictive limitations. But because of these causes and conditions of delusion, we are only able to understand the world within the fixed, narrow scope of seeing, hearing, experiencing, and knowing. Some beings are born due to being bound together by shared karma. Other beings are born due to union or else due to separation. Because of this reason, being bound together by shared karma allows us, when taking birth in this world, to manifest only after having shared karma. This primarily refers to birth from a womb and birth from an egg. What does shared karma mean? Shared karma involves the karma of the father, the karma of the mother, and the karma of the incoming child taking birth. These 3 karmas are shared. If among these three karmas even one is missing, we cannot be born from a womb or an egg. For birth from an egg, although it comes from within an egg, the causes and conditions of the parents are also required. For birth from a womb, it goes without saying. For example, if the parents' conditions are complete, but the child's karma is lacking, it will not work. If the child's karma is present, but the father's karma or the mother's karma is missing, it also will not work. Therefore, for birth from a womb or an egg to occur, it is absolutely necessary for these three types of karma to be complete before it can manifest. Some commentaries offer slightly different explanations, but interpreting this through the four types of birth is probably a better approach. In the guiding commentary on the Shurangama Sutra and Master Chang Shui's commentary, several of them explain it using the four types of birth. This is probably better. Then birth due to union or else due to separation. Some texts say union becomes moisture birth, separation becomes metamorphosis. There are two ways of phrasing it, but the meaning is basically the same. Union refers to birth from moisture. As for birth from moisture, it occurs because the consciousness of the sentient being must unite with external elements, including the earth element or moisture here, and after uniting with the external environment, it can manifest. Then separation becoming metamorphosis means it separates from the aforementioned causes and conditions of moisture birth, womb birth, and egg birth, and relying solely on the miraculous manifestation of karmic power, or the power of an emanation. It is called birth via metamorphosis. So this union and separation becoming metamorphosis, if it becomes metamorphosis. Union and separation becoming metamorphosis. Union refers to the preceding moisture birth, and separation becoming metamorphosis refers to the latter birth via metamorphosis. This also works. Or as explained in some editions, union simply means to become. That is to say, through union, moisture birth comes to be, and through separation, birth via metamorphosis comes to be. It is explained this way. Next, it specifically discusses some processes of birth from a womb. A point of light is seen to appear. When the light is seen clearly, deluded thoughts arise. Here, what is it like during birth from a womb? A point of light is seen. Because the Bardo body, generally in the state of the Bardo, everything is pitch black. It is entirely like a night without lamps. However, at this time, if you look, you cannot see any activities of other sentient beings. Only the parents you have a karmic connection with for taking birth in a womb who are over there. If they are engaging in impure conduct, even from a great distance, you can see a clear light, like a lamp. Then, like some moths that rush toward a lamp at night, the Bardo body sees the light. This light, due to the manifestation of the sentient being's karma, appears as a bright form. In the Bardo realm, for most sentient beings, it is pitch black. Very pitiful. At that moment, seeing your parents somewhere engaging in intercourse. Once you see this, after seeing such a form, you head toward it. Then, when the light is seen clearly, deluded thoughts arise. Once you arrive there and observe their entire process of interaction, at this point you think in your heart, I want to participate. Then you generate your own discriminating thoughts and try to enter into their entire process of engaging in intercourse. At this time, both hatred in response to incompatible points of view and love in response to compatible ways of thinking. This is just like what is taught in the Abhidharma Kosha and other treatises. If you have an incompatible view, it becomes hatred. If you have a compatible thought, it becomes attachment. What is an incompatible view? An incompatible view, for instance, if you are a male, you see this, when you are about to take birth, if it is incompatible with yourself, that is to say, if you are going to become a male in the future, and if you see As a male, you should have an affinity toward the female. If a male sees the male, this is an incompatible view, which generates hatred. If it is a female, seeing the female generates hatred. Then, if you yourself are going to become a male, seeing the male opposite you generates hatred toward him. This should be the same as in the Abhidharma Kosha. When the parents are engaging in impure conduct, depending on what you will become in the future, you will generate, for example, a female generates attachment to the father, a male generates attachment to the mother. So with a compatible thought, attachment is generated. And with an incompatible thought, hatred is generated. With such attachment or hatred you enter, because when both parents are present, you generate hatred toward the father and generate attachment toward the mother. With such an intention, you enter. This is the same as in our Abhidharma Kosha. After this, the thought of love flows out to the fertilized egg, which is then drawn into the womb. The thought of love flowing out actually refers to when the parents engage in intercourse, the emergence of the seed of the father's semen and mother's blood. Then this seed, if you grasp it as I, this is me, and you yourself accept it, accepting your own thought and discriminating notion, this is the true manifestation of your entering the womb. At this point, you are able to enter the womb. Thus the parents' intercourse leads to the attraction of a being with whom they share a common karma. The parents' intercourse, or their engaging in such relations, actually, what does it attract? It attracts those with shared karma, sentient beings who have a karmic connection with you. It is capable of drawing them in. If you do not have the karmic connection, even if you want to enter into it, you cannot be drawn in. So generally, whoever the parents may be, actually, it is all related to past lives, either virtuous karma or non-virtuous karma. This karmic connection is very important. If you do not have shared karma, even if you see this, because sentient beings in the Bardo are extremely numerous, just like snowflakes swirling in winter, they are incredibly numerous. But among them, those who truly have the karmic connection are still very few. If the connection is present at that moment, you can enter. Due to these causes and conditions, the fetus develops, passing through the Kalala stage, the Arbuda stage, and the stages that follow. With these causes and conditions, entering the womb begins. After entering the womb, within the mother's womb, we previously discussed the 7 stages of fetal development: the round jelly, viscous ellipse, thick oblong, firm oval, as well as fish-shaped, turtle-shaped, and so on. These are also mentioned in the words of my perfect teacher and discussed in treatises like Finding Comfort and Ease in the Nature of Mind. With these causes and conditions, during the process of entering the womb, in the first 7 days there is the round jelly, which is very, as some modern commentaries describe it, a slippery coagulation. It's probably very slippery, equivalent to something like mucus, that kind of shape. Then for Arbuda, we call it a viscous ellipse. The second fetal stage is the viscous ellipse, also very, very small, and so forth. Just like this, gradually, then during the fetal stages, our common Tibetan folk saying is that one stays in the womb for 9 months and 10 days. Actually, the Maharatnakuta Sutra also states that it is 38 weeks. 38 weeks amounts to 266 days. This basically corresponds with the duration calculated by modern medicine. In the Han region, a common saying is carrying a child for 10 months, but generally speaking it probably won't be 10 full months. For the vast majority it is a shared karmic experience, no matter what it is actually, the duration of pregnancy and all these details, including in the sutra of Ananda entering the womb and other related sutras, are explained quite clearly. The entire time frame and process, these are all explained explained quite clearly. So just as mentioned, sentient beings will become like this. With that being the case, birth from a womb, birth from an egg, birth in the presence of moisture, and birth via metamorphosis come about in response to these circumstances, whether it is birth from a womb, birth from an egg, birth from moisture, or birth via metamorphosis. All of these sentient beings, actually, it only corresponds according to their karmic power. For womb birth, egg birth, for all sentient beings, karma is the most primary factor. Then their external manifestation of birth is a secondary condition. For birth from a womb or an egg, your karma is actually very important. If the karma is corresponding, then these external methods of generation can all be possessed. As we are in samsara, next, they are explained individually. Birth from an egg arises from mental activity. For birth from an egg, mental activity is the primary factor. Then, emotion and desire are minor conditions. Generally, for birth from an egg, it is probably led by the entry of discriminating thoughts. Then emotion and desire are perhaps not the primary factors. Birth from a womb occurs because of emotion. For causes like womb birth, it is primarily driven by emotion and desire. It is primarily driven by the contact and emotion of the parents. Then the mental activity generated. These mental activities make up the minority. Birth in the presence of moisture occurs through union. For moisture birth, it is mainly feeling, contact, and union. There must be contact with external matter. For example, if an insect is generated within feces, it makes a kind of contact with this external substance. Only through such a relationship of union can it be induced. And birth via metamorphosis is brought about through separation. For metamorphosis, it is certainly separated from these emotions and desires and so forth, from the aforementioned methods of birth. It is generated relying on a special, miraculously manifested cause. So the following states: because of emotion, mental activity, union, and separation, beings may shift from one form of birth to another form. For all sentient beings in our 6 realms, if they are to come into existence, it is either through emotion or mental activity or union or separation. These 4, that is to say, womb birth, metamorphosis, egg birth, moisture birth, these 4, they shift from one form to another. Actually, this is not fixed. It's true that perhaps in this life I am born from a womb, in the next life I become born from an egg, and then in the life after that I undergo moisture birth or metamorphosis. Therefore, in this world, these 4 types of birth change very easily. They ascend or fall entirely in accord with their karma. These are the causes and conditions for the perpetuation of beings. All sentient beings whatsoever are subject to the control of karmic power. Without karmic power, they could not come into existence. Once there is karma, they ascend or fall according to their different karmic powers. To ascend is to go upward to the higher realms. To fall is to plunge downward, to sink. So, just like bees in a jar, all of these sentient beings, actually, they must go up and down and up, continuously like this within samsara. These causes and conditions are the continuation of sentient beings. This is called the perpetuation of sentient beings. This is called the sentient world. The principles of the physical world and the sentient world have now been explained. Literally, it is quite simple, not that difficult. But if we do not look closely, if we do not interpret it, it seems it's also not that easy to understand. We will conclude the discussion here.
Kirgana jirano chupai chupun zolen droadrasya
Bandangara Badna Sadarda Bandangara Badna Sada Om Bandar Gara Banma Sadar Do